Everyone expected the paralyzed teen to leave the shelter empty-handed, just like every other visitor. But when he met the gaze of a battered German shepherd, time seemed to freeze. The abused dog did the unthinkable. What he did next brought everyone to tears and changed everything. Ethan's hands gripped the wheels of his chair as he rolled across the cracked pavement toward the shelter's entrance. At 16, he hadn't imagined his life would look like this. Bound to metal and rubber, his legs unresponsive since the accident that changed everything, a few volunteers glanced up from their chores, their expressions softening when they saw Ethan approaching. They knew why he was here, but none of them expected him to stay long. Most visitors couldn't bear the sadness in these walls. Ethan's mother hovered protectively a step behind, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She whispered that they could leave any time if it became too much, but Ethan shook his head. Bear the sadness in these walls. Ethan's mother hovered protectively a step behind, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She whispered that they could leave any time if it became too much, but Ethan shook his head. For reasons he couldn't explain, he needed to see the dogs today. Maybe in their eyes he'd find something he'd been missing, something he'd almost given up hoping for. At the far end of the shelter, in a kennel that rarely saw visitors linger, lay a German shepherd named Ranger. His coat, once a proud sable, was dulled by neglect and matted along his ribs. Scars crisscrossed his muzzle, faded reminders of a life spent chained in a backyard where no one came to soothe his cries. Ranger didn't bark like the others. He simply watched, dark eyes wary, as if measuring each soul who dared approach his cage. Shelter staff had learned to keep their distance. When anyone got too close, Ranger would bare his teeth in a silent warning, his body tensing for the had come to expect. He had been rescued months ago from a property where he'd nearly starved to death. But even with regular meals and kind words, his trust remained locked behind invisible walls. Some days volunteers whispered that Ranger was beyond saving, too broken to be rehomed. But no one could bring themselves to give up. He was still young, barely 3 years old, and in the rare moments when he thought no one was looking, his gaze would soften and a faint spark of hope would flicker behind his guarded eyes. Ethan guided his wheelchair slowly down the narrow aisle, the soft hum of its motor blending with the chorus of barking that erupted at his arrival. He tried not to flinch when paws slammed against kennel doors, or when shrill yelps echoed off the concrete walls. His gaze wandered from one hopeful face to the next, each dog pressing forward as if willing him to notice them. But it wasn't until he reached the last kennel that he felt something shift inside. Didn't move. He lay with his head resting on his front paws, one ear flicking lazily at the noise. When Ethan's chair rolled to a stop in front of him, the German shepherd slowly lifted his gaze. Their eyes met. Two beings who had been broken in different ways, now seeing something familiar reflected back. For a long moment, neither looked away. Behind Ethan, a volunteer sucked in a breath. "Careful," she warned softly, taking a cautious step closer. He doesn't like strangers. But Ethan didn't feel afraid. He felt understood. With trembling fingers, he reached toward the wire mesh, his hand hovering just inches from Rears's scarred nose. Rears's body stiffened. The room seemed to hold its breath as he slowly rose to his feet. His gaze never wavered. In a movement so deliberate it made Ethan's heart ache, Ranger stepped forward, closing the distance until his nose touched the boy's outstretched hand. Ethan felt the rough warmth of Rez's breath against his skin, and his throat tightened so suddenly he almost pulled away. But he stayed still, letting the dog take his time. For a few seconds, Ranger only stood there, head lowered, nose brushing Ethan's trembling fingers. Then, as if he'd made some silent decision, Ranger leaned in farther and pressed the full weight of his scarred face against the boy's palm. Gasps rose from the volunteers behind them. One young woman clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes filling with tears. No one had ever seen Ranger choose someone until now. But Ethan wasn't aware of the audience. He was lost in the fragile miracle happening between them. Slowly, he curled his hand to stroke the dog's cheek. Ranger flinched at first, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he let out a long, shaky sigh, the kind that sounded almost like relief. Ethan's vision blurred as he felt the coarse fur beneath his fingertips, felt the dog's heartbeat thrumming against the down Ethan's cheek, landing on the back of his hand. Ranger shifted closer and pressed his forehead into Ethan's lap through the mesh, as if he wanted to be sure the boy wouldn't vanish. Ethan bent over him, shoulders shaking, and buried his face against the fence. "He's never done this," whispered one of the staff, her voice breaking. "Not with anyone." Ethan lifted his head just enough to meet her gaze, his own eyes red and swollen. Maybe he just needed someone who was broken too," he whispered back. And in that moment, neither boy nor dog felt quite so alone. The shelter manager quietly motioned the others back, giving Ethan and Ranger space. Though the kennel door remained closed, it felt like an invisible wall had finally crumbled between them. Rez's tail, which had always hung low in defeat, seemed to loosen something knotted deep inside him. Ethan lifted a shaking hand to wipe his face, then laughed softly through his tears. "Hi," he whispered, voice raw with emotion. "I'm Ethan." Rez's ears flicked forward as if he recognized the name. When Ethan spoke again, his words were quiet but sure. "I know what it feels like when everyone thinks you're too broken to try again." Ranger shifted closer, resting his head fully in Ethan's lap now. The boy laid both hands on the dog's neck, feeling the tension that still lived there. But beneath it, he also felt something fragile and hopeful. The German shepherd let out a soft, rumbling sigh, closing his eyes as though he finally believed he was safe. A volunteer approached and knelt beside Ethan. Her own eyes shimmered with tears. "He hasn't let anyone touch him like that," she murmured. "You don't know what you've done for him." Ethan looked up, his heart swelling in a way he hadn't felt since. "Before the accident, I think maybe he's doing something for me too," he replied. As Rez's tail thumped again, the boy felt a small spark ignite in the darkness he'd carried for so long. A glimmer of belonging, of being needed. For the first time in months, Ethan allowed himself to believe that healing was possible. And it was Ranger, the dog everyone had nearly given up on, who was showing him the way back. The shelter manager cleared his throat, voice gentle as he stepped forward. "Ethan, if you'd like, we can start the adoption process," he offered. "Ranger clearly wants to be with you." For a moment, Ethan could only stare at the man, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He looked down at Ranger, whose brown eyes were fixed on him with a question he somehow understood. Ethan swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "I'd like that more than anything. As if he understood. Rare's ears perked, and his tail swept the floor in a broad, joyful arc. Designed so Ranger could walk safely beside Ethan's wheelchair. Ethan's mother helped buckle it into place, her hands trembling as she tried to keep her composure. When she finished, Ranger leaned gently against the boy's side, his gaze soft and steady. Together, they rolled toward the shelter's entrance. Two souls who had once been abandoned, now choosing each other. As they passed the rows of kennels, the barking quieted, as if every dog sensed something extraordinary was happening. For Ethan and Ranger, it was the first step toward a life neither had dared to dream of again. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe.